The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly when Sheriff Jack Morrison found her. It was July 1868, 3 years after the Civil War, and Morrison thought he'd witnessed every cruelty one human could inflict upon another. He was wrong. Copper Creek was a small frontier town where Mexicans, Apaches, and American settlers tried to coexist in a balance as fragile as spun glass. The town sat halfway between Tucson and Phoenix, a dusty collection of weathered buildings that served as a way station for travelers and those seeking to disappear into the vast wilderness. Morrison had been sheriff for 2 years, a tall man with steel-gray eyes and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. His face was weathered from years of outdoor living, and the townspeople respected him for his fairness and unwillingness to back down from trouble. That sweltering morning, Morrison was making his usual rounds when he heard a weak moan coming from the alley behind McGillicuddy's hardware store. At first he thought it might be an injured animal, but something about the sound made his blood run cold. It was too deliberate, too human, carrying a quality of suffering that spoke of intelligence and awareness. He approached slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his Colt .45. What he saw when he rounded the corner made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a girl, no more than 16, huddled against the weathered wooden wall. Her black hair was singed and matted to her scalp, sticky with blood and dirt. Her skin was covered in burns that looked like they'd been made with branding irons. The marks were deliberate, methodical, forming patterns that spoke of prolonged torture. She wore the remnants of what had once been a white dress, now brown with dried blood and dirt. Her eyes, when they lifted to meet his, were 2 pools of ancient pain that seemed too old for someone so young. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with a suffering that Morrison recognized from his own mirror after the war. She opened her cracked lips and whispered, "Water, please." Morrison's hand trembled as he reached for his canteen. He'd seen wounded soldiers beg for water on battlefields, but this was different. This was a child, and someone had done this to her deliberately. "Easy now, miss," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I'm gonna help you. My name's Jack Morrison, and I'm the sheriff here." As he gently tilted the canteen to her lips, he noticed the burns on her arms and face formed a pattern, circular marks that could only have come from the end of a hot poker. Someone had held her down and pressed heated metal against her skin, not once but many times. The water seemed to bring her back to consciousness. She tried to sit up straighter, wincing with every movement. "Who did this to you?" Morrison asked, his voice barely controlled. The girl's eyes darted around frantically. My family," she whispered. "They said I brought shame. They said I had to pay for my sins." Morrison felt his jaw clench. A family doing this to their own blood? That was a special kind of evil. "What's your name, child?" "Maria," she said, then quickly added, "Maria Vasquez." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. The Vasquez family owned a small ranch about 10 miles south of town. Esteban Vasquez was known as a hard man who ruled his family with an iron fist. But Morrison had never imagined he was capable of this level of brutality. "Doc Patterson needs to see you," Morrison said, carefully scooping the girl into his arms. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, all bones and burned skin. As he carried her toward the doctor's office, Maria grabbed his shirt with surprising strength. Her fingers were torn and bloody, the nails broken and caked with dirt. "They think I'm dead," she whispered urgently. "They buried me. I clawed my way out." Morrison stopped walking. "What did you say?" "They put me in a hole, covered me with dirt. But I wasn't dead yet. I dug until my fingers bled, until I could breathe again." The sheriff's mind reeled. He'd heard of Apache punishment rituals, Mexican honor killings, but burying someone alive? That was beyond anything he could fathom. Dr. Patterson's office was a small building next to the general store. The doctor was a graying man in his 50s who'd come west after losing his wife and daughter to cholera. When Morrison kicked open the door, carrying Maria in his arms, Patterson took one look at the girl and immediately cleared his examination table. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Patterson breathed as he examined her wounds. "Jack, these burns are intentional. Someone held her down and did this systematically. Look at the pattern. They're evenly spaced, deliberately placed. Can you help her?" Morrison asked. "I'll do what I can, but some of these burns go deep. She'll carry these scars for life." Patterson looked up from his work. Who could do such a thing to a child? Her own family, apparently. The Vasquez family. The doctor's hands stilled. Esteban Vasquez? That's hard to believe. Over the next few hours, as Patterson worked to clean and dress Maria's wounds, the girl's story began to emerge in fragments. She spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, her voice often dropping to a whisper as she relived the nightmare she'd endured. She'd been promised in marriage to a man twice her age, a wealthy rancher named Don Eduardo Ramirez from a neighboring county. The arrangement had been made when she was only 14, a business transaction disguised as a family alliance. But Maria had fallen in love with someone else, a young Apache brave named Running Wolf, who worked as a scout for the cavalry garrison at Fort Huachuca. Running Wolf was different from other Apache men she'd known. He could read and write in both English and Spanish, having been educated by missionaries as a child. He spoke of a future where people of different cultures might live together in peace. To Maria, trapped in a world of arranged marriages and rigid traditions, he represented freedom and possibility. Their relationship had been conducted in secret, stolen moments when she could slip away from her family's watchful eyes. They would meet by the old cottonwood tree near Willow Creek, where Running Wolf would tell her stories of his people and teach her words in the Apache language. When her father discovered the relationship, he'd gone into a rage that terrified even his own sons. Mexican families took their daughter's virtue seriously, and being with an Apache was seen as the ultimate betrayal. Instead of simply disowning her, Esteban had decided she needed to be punished in a way that would serve as a warning to his other daughters. "He said I brought dishonor to our name," Maria whispered as Patterson wrapped her burned arms. "He said the only way to restore our family's honor was through blood and fire." The torture had lasted 3 days. Each morning, Esteban would heat an iron rod in the fire until it glowed red-hot, then press it against her skin while her mother and sisters watched in horrified silence. They'd called it purification, claiming they were burning the Apache influence out of her. Her mother, Carmen, had wept but hadn't intervened. Her sisters had been forced to watch, their faces pale with terror as they witnessed what happened to daughters who disobeyed their father's will. On the 3rd day, when Maria had stopped screaming and barely responded to their touches, they'd assumed she was dead. Rather than giving her a proper burial, they'd thrown her into a shallow grave behind their ranch house and covered her with dirt. But Maria Vasquez was stronger than they'd imagined. She'd regained consciousness underground, tasting dirt and feeling the weight of earth on her chest. Using her fingernails and sheer will to live, she'd clawed her way upward through the loose soil, digging with a desperation born of absolute terror. "How long were you underground?" Morrison asked. "Don't know. Felt like forever. When I got out, the moon was high and the coyotes were howling. I could see the house, see the light in the windows, but I couldn't go back. I just started walking." She'd walked through the night, following the creek bed toward town. By dawn, she'd reached Copper Creek, but her strength had given out. She'd collapsed in the main street, dragging herself to the alley where Morrison had found her. As the day wore on, word spread through the town about the burned girl. The Mexican families whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust at the Vasquez family's actions, others muttering that maybe the girl had brought it on herself. The Apache scout, Running Wolf, appeared at the doctor's office that evening. He was a young man in his early 20s, with quiet strength that came from living between two worlds. His dark hair was braided with leather strips, and he wore a mixture of Apache and army clothing. When he saw Maria lying on the doctor's table, her arms wrapped in bandages and her face pale with pain, his carefully maintained composure cracked. His hands shook as he reached out to touch her face, and tears ran down his cheeks. "I should have protected her," he said in accented English, his voice breaking. "This is my fault." I should have taken her away from here. No, Maria whispered, reaching out to touch his hand with her bandaged fingers. They chose this, not you. They chose hate over love, tradition over humanity. Morrison watched the interaction with growing respect for both young people. In a world where love between different cultures was seen as forbidden, they'd found something real and genuine. The next morning, Morrison knew he had to ride out to the Vasquez ranch. Justice in the territory was often rough and quick, but this situation required careful handling. He took Deputy Williams with him, a steady man who spoke fluent Spanish. The ride took them through beautiful and unforgiving landscape. Red sandstone formations rose from the desert floor like ancient cathedrals, but Morrison found no beauty in the journey today. The Vasquez ranch was a modest spread, with a small adobe house surrounded by corrals. When Esteban saw the lawman riding up, his face went pale. He knew why they were there. "Señor Vasquez," Morrison called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." The Mexican rancher was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work. His wife, Carmen, emerged from the house with their 3 remaining daughters. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Esteban asked. "Your daughter Maria is alive." The words hung in the desert air. Carmen gasped and crossed herself, while the daughters looked at each other with wide eyes. Esteban's face hardened. "I have no daughter named Maria. She's in town, getting medical treatment for the burns you gave her. She told us everything, about the torture, about being buried alive." "That girl brought shame to our family name," Esteban said, his voice rising. "She was with an Apache. An Apache. She made her choice." Morrison felt his temper flare. "So you decided to torture her and bury her alive?" "We did what was necessary to preserve our honor." "Honor?" Deputy Williams stepped forward. "You call torturing a child honor?" Carmen finally spoke, her voice trembling. "She was our daughter. We raised her and she threw it all away for a savage. That savage has shown more humanity than any of you," Morrison said coldly. The standoff continued for several minutes. Finally, Morrison made his decision. "Esteban Vasquez, you and your family are no longer welcome in Copper Creek. You have 1 week to sell your ranch and leave the territory. If I see you again, I'll arrest you for attempted murder." It was frontier justice. Imperfect but practical. The family would lose everything, but they'd keep their lives. Over the following weeks, Maria slowly recovered under Doc Patterson's care. The physical wounds began to heal, though the scars would remain forever. Running Wolf visited her every day, bringing herbs from his grandmother and stories from his world. The Apache community, initially suspicious, gradually began to accept Maria as one of their own. Running Wolf's grandmother, a respected medicine woman named White Dove, came to examine Maria's wounds and declared that she had the spirit of a warrior. "She has walked in the shadow world and returned," the old woman said through Running Wolf's translation. "The spirits have marked her as special." The townspeople of Copper Creek were divided. Some were horrified by what had been done to her and offered help. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh bread and soup. Sarah McGillicuddy offered new clothing, but others whispered that she'd brought trouble on herself by crossing cultural lines. Morrison found himself increasingly frustrated with these attitudes. He'd fought in a war that was supposed to be about freedom and human dignity, yet here he was witnessing the same prejudice and hatred. One evening he stopped by the doctor's office to check on Maria's progress. She was sitting up in bed, her color much improved. "How are you feeling, miss?" he asked. "Better," she said, managing a small smile. "Dr. Patterson says the burns are healing well. Some will leave scars, but I'm alive." "That's what matters," Morrison said. "Your family left yesterday, sold their ranch and headed south toward Mexico." Maria nodded, showing no emotion. "I expected as much. They would rather start over somewhere else than admit they were wrong." "Do you regret it?" Morrison asked. "Loving Running Wolf, knowing what it cost you?" Maria was quiet for a long moment. "Sheriff, in my culture, women are taught that our worth comes from our obedience, our purity. But what is honor if it requires cruelty? What is purity if it means denying love?" She turned to look at him. her dark eyes filled with wisdom. I chose love, and yes, it nearly killed me. But I'm still here, and I'm free to choose my own path now. That's worth any scar. Running Wolf appeared in the doorway, carrying a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. "Grandmother has sent something for you," he said to Maria. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a necklace made of turquoise and silver, worked in intricate Apache patterns. "She says this will protect you from evil spirits and help your wounds heal from the inside out." As Running Wolf fastened the necklace around Maria's neck, Morrison saw something in their interaction that gave him hope. Despite everything they'd endured, they'd found something pure and genuine. The weeks turned into months, and Maria's recovery progressed steadily. Dr. Patterson was amazed by her resilience. The burns healed into pale scars, and her strength returned gradually. More importantly, she began to smile again, to laugh at Running Wolf's stories. The Apache community had fully embraced her, teaching her their customs and language. White Dove had taken her under her wing, declaring that Maria had been chosen by the spirits for a special purpose. 6 months after that terrible morning when Morrison had found her in the alley, Maria had made a remarkable transformation. The frightened, burned girl had become a confident young woman who moved between the Mexican, American, and Apache communities with grace. She'd learned to speak Apache fluently and had become an unofficial translator and mediator. The wedding took place on a warm October evening, with the desert painted gold by the setting sun. Morrison performed his first wedding ceremony as a justice of the peace. It was a unique ceremony that blended traditions from all 3 cultures represented in Copper Creek. Maria wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson had made for her, with traditional Apache jewelry and a Mexican mantilla. The ceremony was conducted in English, Spanish, and Apache, with Morrison reading vows that the couple had written themselves. "Do you, Maria Vasquez, take this man to be your husband, to stand with him against whatever storms may come?" "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Running Wolf, take this woman to be your wife, to protect her and cherish her, to honor the courage she has shown?" "I do," he replied in English, then repeated it in Apache and Spanish. The ceremony was attended by members of all 3 communities, Apache warriors and women, Mexican families who had come to respect Maria's strength, and American settlers who had been moved by her story. As Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, he thought about the nature of family. Maria's blood relatives had tried to kill her in the name of honor, while strangers from different cultures had risked their own standing to help her heal and find happiness. The young couple settled on a small plot of land just outside town, where Running Wolf used his knowledge of horses to start a breeding operation, and Maria established a garden that seemed to bloom despite the harsh desert conditions. Their home became a gathering place for people from all 3 communities. They had children, 3 boys and 2 girls, who grew up trilingual and tricultural, comfortable in all the worlds that made up their heritage. The children learned Apache traditions from their father's people, Mexican customs from their mother's community, and American ways from the school in Copper Creek. Maria never spoke to her birth family again, though she heard through travelers that they had settled in Sonora and were telling people that their daughter had died of fever. The Vasquez family had chosen to maintain their version of events, rather than acknowledge their daughter's survival. Years later, when Morrison was an old man with silver hair and a cane, he would tell the story of Maria Vasquez to anyone who would listen. It became one of the legends of Copper Creek, passed down through generations as an example of how love could triumph over hatred, how courage could overcome even the most terrible adversity. The story spread beyond Copper Creek, carried by travelers to other frontier towns. It became a tale told around campfires and in saloons, a reminder that even in harsh lands, there was room for compassion and hope. Maria became something of a legend in the territory. She worked as a translator and mediator, helping resolve disputes between communities. Her ability to speak 3 languages made her invaluable in a region where misunderstandings could escalate into violence. She also became an advocate for women and children in situations similar to her own. When word came of girls being forced into unwanted marriages or suffering abuse, Maria would quietly intervene, offering shelter and support. Her home became known as a safe haven where the desperate could find help without judgment. Running Wolf supported her work, understanding that her experiences had given her a unique perspective on survival. The burns on her body gradually faded to pale scars that were barely visible unless you knew to look for them. But the strength she'd shown that day in the alley behind McGillicuddy's store remained as bright as ever, a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure and overcome. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the sound of coyotes calling across the vastness, Maria would sit on her porch with Running Wolf and watch the stars emerge. They would talk about their children, their work, their dreams for the future. Sometimes visitors would ask her about that terrible time when her family had tried to kill her, about how she had found the strength to claw her way out of her own grave. She would always give the same answer. When you have nothing left to lose, you discover what you're truly made of. I was made of something stronger than hate. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of Maria's story. In a harsh land where survival often seemed to depend on matching cruelty with cruelty, she had chosen a different path. She had refused to let hatred and violence define her, choosing instead to build something better from the ashes of her old life. The girl with the burns had asked for water that morning when Morrison found her, and in receiving it, she had found not just physical healing but spiritual renewal. She had discovered that love was stronger than tradition, that compassion was more powerful than vengeance, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to become the monster that others expected you to be. As the years passed and Copper Creek grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community, Maria's story became part of its foundation myth. Children would learn about the girl who had been buried alive but had clawed her way back to the surface, about the love that had transcended cultural boundaries, about the family that had been built on choice rather than blood. And on quiet nights, when the desert wind whispered through the mesquite and the stars shone down on the red rocks and endless sky, old-timers would gather to tell the story once more, ensuring that it would never be forgotten. It was a tale of cruelty and courage, of a girl who had been buried alive by her own family but had emerged from the earth like a desert flower pushing through stone. She had asked for water, and in receiving it, she had found her freedom. But not everyone accepted Maria's transformation so easily. For many in Copper Creek, the memory of what she had endured was an uncomfortable reminder that the traditions they upheld might one day be questioned. After all, if a young woman, buried alive for defying the customs of her people, could be reborn stronger and more human, what did that say about those who still clung to hatred, pride, and vengeance as if they were virtues? Some whispered in corners that Maria was some kind of witch, that her survival was unnatural, a sign that something dark had brought her back from the world of the dead. But those who truly knew her, who had seen the way she cared for the wounded, the way her hands touched the sick with a tenderness that felt like the earth itself after rain, knew that what lived within her was not witchcraft, but faith. Faith in something greater than pain, greater than betrayal, greater even than death. Maria never spoke openly about her family, not because she wanted to hide the past, but because she believed that to relive hatred was to give it new strength. Her philosophy was simple: what is not fed, dies. And she had chosen to let hatred die. Instead, she spoke of new beginnings. She told stories of people who had lost everything, husbands, children, land, and who had still found reasons to plant again, to love again, to smile again. Every word from her lips carried the weight of experience and the lightness of a stubborn, almost impossible hope. It was that very stubbornness that led Maria to create Copper Creek's first school. Some laughed. Others threatened her. "There's no place for that here," they said. "Children should learn from their parents, as it's always been." But Maria simply listened in silence. The same silence she had learned to respect when she was beneath the earth, among roots and worms, waiting for death. She knew time would do its work, that each of her actions, each act of kindness, was a seed, and seeds, sooner or later, sprout. The school was small, made of clay and wood, with open windows facing the desert. Inside, boys and girls from different backgrounds learned to read, to write, to think. Many came out of curiosity, others brought by mothers who saw something sacred in Maria. Over time, the space became a gathering point. The stories told their past from generation to generation, and all of them inevitably returned to the same origin: the girl who had asked for water. It was not easy. It never is. There were arson attempts, stones thrown, poisonous words whispered to the children. But there were also unexpected defenses. An old hunter, who once cursed Maria's presence, showed up one day with a box full of books. A woman, widow of a soldier, offered to teach sewing. A boy, the son of one of the men who tried to destroy the school, wrote the town's first poem in honor of the woman with steady eyes and deep scars. And then, something extraordinary began to happen. The scars were no longer seen as marks of pain, but understood as symbols of resilience. The young ones wanted to touch them, to listen wide-eyed to each fragment of Maria's story that slipped out during school breaks. She, with patience, spoke less of herself and more of the values that guided her life. Empathy, silent courage, the strength not to strike back. It was around this time that Copper Creek truly began to change. Trade blossomed, families once divided by rivalries reconciled. And on the cooler nights, when the sky seemed to breathe along with the earth, residents would gather around the school, now expanded, to hear the old stories. Stories that blended pain and rebirth, silence and song. And on all of those nights, without exception, Maria would remain silent for a few minutes before speaking. A deep, almost reverent silence. Not like someone searching for the right words, but like someone paying respect to the lives that came before, to the pains that had no voice, to those who had been buried without a chance to return. She didn't want to be remembered as a martyr, nor as a saint. She wanted to be remembered as an example, as the woman who refused to be defined by her tragedy, as the flame that, though lit in the middle of the desert, refused to be extinguished. And perhaps unintentionally, that's exactly what she became.